Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just mask and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the graphic novel apostle.
Hello, and welcome back to the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. I'm your host, Mark Orenberger, and I'm so happy to be here with you, as always. And we have a special guest today, an artist that I have been wanting to talk to on the podcast for quite a while. Actually had the good fortune to get to meet in person just a few weeks ago, and I have been familiar with his work for about a year, and I'm so excited to share it with you. Today we have Arkansas-based artist Sean Fitzgibbon. Sean, hello, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on. This is great.
Oh, this is wonderful, and I think it's going to be a real treat to get to talk to you. I'd like for the main focus of our interview today to be your published book, What Follows is True, Crescent Hotel, about the famous, infamous, probably haunted hotel in northwest Arkansas in Eureka Springs, the Crescent Hotel. And of course, as we go along, I want to talk to you as well about another book that you are doing under the What Follows is True series, focused on the Plum Bayou Mounds located here in central Arkansas, where I am. Now, this will be the first time on the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast we have focused on is it appropriate to call it a nonfiction graphic novel or a graphic nonfiction? How do you describe it to people, Sean?
I usually say graphic nonfiction just because, novels are inherently work of fiction, so I don't I but I've also said nonfiction graphic novel just because graphic novels are so ubiquitous nowadays.
Sure.
And I think most people get it, if you say that, because sometimes graphic nonfiction, they're not quite sure, but, you know.
It makes it sound like it's gory almost. It's a
Right.
graphic nonfiction.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, maybe if I was to say like a historical graphic nonfiction, yeah, I don't know, or a historical, I don't know. I don't know what to call. I'm not sure.
Well, when you get that finalized, let me know and we'll go back and update anything in the podcast we need to.
Right.
So, Sean, you are based out of Northwest Arkansas and specifically you're located in Fayetteville, is that
Yep,
correct?
that's right.
Would you, before we get into talking about Crescent Hotel, would you talk to the audience just a little bit about what your background is as an artist?
So I originally moved to Fayetteville back in 2003 to pursue my master's in fine arts. Graduated in '06, and since then I taught as an adjunct at the University of Arkansas for a while, and now I'm up in Bentonville teaching adjunct at the community college up there, and I do workshops all up and down the area, as well as exhibit my work. I've done since I was in grad school, and while I was in grad school, I did a lot of gallery work. Yeah, that's kind of the thing with graduate school is you're putting together, you're kind of working on your artist statement. You're always putting together like your thesis show, what and I did like three different series in grad school. And every time I would put together a series, I would just start exhibiting them around Northwest Arkansas, like in coffee shops and things like that. As at that time, I'd be considered more of an emerging artist because I was still more or less a student. And since then, I've shown, oh gosh, in quite a few different states. But I've always loved storytelling. I've always loved, graphic novels. I just love the narrative aspect because I've also loved film, particularly like a lot of old films. And when I say old films, I even mean going back to like the silent film era. These filmmakers were they were like the pioneers, like they didn't really have any kind of rules to what they were doing. And I kind of look at graphic novels in the same way because it is such a young medium. Yeah, there's just the possibilities are almost endless of how you can tell stories in that manner. And I also have this love for art history. Like mostly teach studio art, but I also teach a little bit of like some history classes for mostly non-majors, which is a lot of fun because I'm kind of introducing them to the world of art history. And so I've always wanted to kind of marry those sensibilities of like storytelling with art.
So, Sean, you chose to do your first nonfiction graphic novel
Yeah,
on the subject of the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs, Arkansas.
yeah,
And for our listeners who might not be familiar with it, tell me a little bit about Eureka Springs and then about the Crescent Hotel itself and what
sure.
drew you to this as the subject for your nonfiction graphic
Yeah,
novel.
of course. Yeah. So since I was a kid, I'm originally from like Southwest Missouri, and my parents would take my sister and I to Eureka Springs when I was a kid. Like and we didn't go all that often, but we went. I remember going there a handful of times, and I remember the first time going to Eureka Springs, just being kind of blown away just by how it's beautiful. It's a beautiful little town. It's all Victorian, and it's just so unusual. It's one of the 9 most unusual towns, according to Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not. So
Sure.
none of the roads in Eureka Springs intersect. There's no right angles in the town, so it's all just these winding roads, and it's really just kind of down in this valley. And you have all these Victorian homes perched on like limestone bluffs, high above, and it's wild to see that because the only reason they're able to do that whenever they built the town is because it's on limestone. Otherwise, they just slide down the side of the mountain. But it's like,
Yeah, and you really drew this out in your book.
yeah,
You know, the early part of the Crescent Hotel book that you did is really just an introduction to Eureka Springs and what an interesting place that it is. And I do want to talk to you a little bit about that introduction and your storytelling approach that you took in this book. Because, first of all, I need our listeners to know this. This book is gorgeous. It is so beautiful. And now you hand drew all of these illustrations throughout the book, I guess first in pencil, inked
yeah,
over, and then watercolor painted all of them as well, correct?
yeah, correct.
And especially in the early part of the book, when we are seeing all these scenes of downtown Eureka Springs and
Yeah,
leading out to where the Crescent Hotel is, we get these points of view that I have to imagine, and maybe you can correct me if I've assumed something incorrect, that maybe you drove around town and took photographs out of the window of your car and
yep,
then drew from those because
yep,
in a lot of them, I love that you did this. You see the framing even in your drawings in the book of the windshield of your car or that part of the window ledge.
oh
What
yeah.
an interesting way to do this. What made you decide to take that approach?
Okay, so I really want to immerse the viewers, and I feel like the best way to do that is to have them sort of assimilate into me as the your point of entry into this story, because it's like I go on the ghost tour in the book, I'm driving around in the book, I'm doing all this stuff, but I never really say anything in the book. Even when
Mhm.
I'm interviewing people, I don't think I ever say a word in the book. It's people answering my questions, it's like so they can infer that. But I really wanted that to just feel like what it's like to drive around town in Eureka Springs.
And you shifted point of view quite a number of times. So, first of all, we're getting your eyeballs view in some of those early
Yeah.
images.
Yeah.
And then as we move into a little bit more of the narrative, and I guess even the text that goes along with that is written in first person narrative. And you're
Yeah.
talking about
Yep.
going
Yep.
to Eureka Springs as a child.
Yep.
And
Yep.
then as we move into you starting to research for this book, you become an we would say on camera, I guess if we were talking about television or movie,
Right.
um, person. And
Yeah.
so we see you sitting in a library. We
Yeah.
see you sitting in offices of some of these elderly folks
Yep. Yep.
in Eureka Springs whose
Yep.
grandparents were directly involved in a lot of the events that you talk about. And then
Yeah.
you also have an additional framing device that you use of some young boys who
Oh.
go
Mm-hmm.
into the
Mm-hmm.
Crescent Hotel at
Yeah.
one point when it was abandoned. I guess after the years that it was Baker Hospital. And we haven't really introduced this subject yet, but most of your book, almost all of it, focuses on the period of time that it was a cancer hospital
Yeah.
run by a con artist
Yeah.
named Norman Baker.
Yes. Correct.
And so we have all these different frames. And then also, and I'm sorry, I know I'm doing a lot of the talking here,
No,
but
no. Yeah,
I was
it's
just
great.
so grabbed by these different and alternating storytelling approaches you used as well. And in just a second, I guess my open-ended question will be to ask you to kind of elaborate how you made these choices. But for the listeners, you did a ton of research. You interviewed a
Yeah.
whole lot of people, town historians, people, as I mentioned, who were, maybe small children at the time or, the grandchildren of people who were important in these stories. And you have these little drop-in text boxes that let the reader know, okay, that, the text that follows comes from the author's interview with this person, the town historian or something like that. And then you get their storytelling, also mixed in with some of the trial transcripts
Yeah.
from when Mr. Baker was ultimately tried in the Eastern District of Arkansas, and also newspaper clippings and that kind of thing. So please, maybe here's a question that I want to ask you is how did you come up with the varied approach to the way you wanted to present this vast amount of material that you gathered?
It really kind of all happened organically, I would say. My skill set is more, like drawing and telling stories visually. And it's like, and doing all the research was a lot of fun, and it was in just meeting all these different people. But there was a point where I was doing so much research. Like I went to the it's called the Writers Colony at Dairy Hollow in Eureka Springs, and I stayed there a week and I interviewed people like all over the town, just walking around everywhere. I went to Muscatine, Iowa, where Baker is from, and I interviewed people all over Muscatine, Iowa, Little Rock, where he was tried. I mean, just you name it. But then there comes a point where it's like I've got literally like two milk crates of photocopies of old newspapers, of letters, my interview notes, old like drawings and magazine. It just every bit of ephemera that I could compile. And then there came a time where I'm like, okay, now what do I do with it? And so my wife, she helped me kind of chronologically organize all of it in terms of just different eras, because you have one section that's like Norman Baker's life, which is very complicated, very complicated, and then and then I also have all this information that's the history of the Crescent Hotel, which is also very complicated. There's a lot of, they both have all these different periods, and they were both right around the same age, like as far as the Crescent and Norman Baker, both were from the late, 1880s. So once I started kind of putting it all together, then I just started figuring out, we needed somebody that we could kind of see this story through their eyes. And so so I kind of broke the book up into three different eras. There's sort of like the early days in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, and then you have like, leading up like Baker's story in the Crescents as well as that, and then all leading up to like when it was the Baker Hospital. And so that's the other section. And then you also have the more contemporary times when I was doing the book. In fact, I've worked on that book so long. If you notice when I'm driving around I've got like one of those, like a Garmin in my car, like back when people had that, like it's in the,
Sure.
it's wild that like that was before I had an iPhone, so I worked on that for so long. So you've got like Baker, and that was such a strange, he was such a kind of a interesting, flamboyant sort of individual that came in and totally transformed the hotel into this abnormal hospital that was more like a circus as far as the facade itself and the garish colors that he painted. I mean, he completely destroyed the Victorian grandeur of the Crescent. He tore out the balustrade in the front, and he took and put up these concrete porches that are there today so it would withstand the weight of patients being wheeled out. And he replaced the interior with, or he changed it to like painting it with like purple walls and Art Deco decor with these cancer is curable posters all over the place with basically all his propaganda. So you also have like on the other side of that, you've got Claude Fuller, and once I kind of learned about Claude Fuller,
Sure. He was the US rep during that period of time for that area of Northwest Arkansas.
and he was also mayor of Eureka Springs. And so
But he and his brother Harvey Fuller were sort of instrumental in bringing Baker down. And Claude Fuller was kind of one of the people that really started to see, like, wait a minute, this is kind of, this is not right. This is kind of abnormal. This is what was happening. And see, he owned the Crescent prior to Baker coming in. And so, I mean, he would leave town a lot to go to Washington, where he served, and then he would come back in town. And when Baker first opened it up, he'd have these lavish parties and showing off his fake cancer hospital. But I felt like, through Claude Fuller's eyes, we're able to kind of see that transformation, of what happened to it. And then he kind of, he starts digging more and more into Baker's history and who he is and where he came from, and then he starts, working with his brother Harvey Fuller, who was the postmaster at Eureka Springs during that time. Oh, and also, like, when you mention the boys, so I interviewed a gentleman by the name of James Raymond Jackson, and he was an older gentleman who, when he was a kid, he and his friend snuck into the Crescent Hotel after Baker was arrested in 1939. And the Baker, you were right about that. Yeah, it was right after, like, it sat dormant throughout World War II until about the, like, mid 40s. It was just this empty building, and he went through there and he told me all about that experience.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of those being based on real life little boys that you met as grown men.
And I looked, and it's wild. He's not with us anymore, but I interviewed him in, I think, 2011 or somewhere around there, and, like, it seems fantastical almost, but it's wild.
Well, I'll tell you, I was surprised when I read your book that it was almost entirely about this. Is it a 2 year period during the late 1930s?
Pretty much, maybe a little more. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, when this hotel served as the Baker Hotel. So, I had heard about the Crescent Hotel, which people can go and stay in today and go on a ghost tour because it's supposed to be haunted. And so I picked up this book thinking, okay, this will be a recounting of all the legends of this supposedly haunted hotel. That's what I anticipated. And once I got in, pretty quickly you realize, oh no, this is a history of this slice in time in this building that has all this history of just a bizarre thing that took place. And so, if you wouldn't mind to, kind of from the beginning, just explain to us a little bit about who this gentleman, Norman Baker, was and what he brought to this town, and then
sure.
how things went from there.
Yeah, yeah. Before I get into that, let me tell you, that is it's those 2 years where all the legends, or not all of them, but the majority of the legends kind of come from. That's because
Oh, is
so
that
many
right?
people, well, so many people died in the
Sure.
Crescent Hotel when it was this, and a lot of people, and many people tragically suffered at the hands of this charlatan who was basically, taking advantage of the fact that it was the Great Depression and people were desperate, and the city made money off Eureka Springs or off the Baker Hospital, because he was bringing in so much money for the city, and that's kind of why they put up with it, because it was bringing in revenue. It was kind of a boon to their local economy.
Sure, and to sort of, kind of set the stage for that just a little
Yeah,
bit. So Norman Baker
yeah,
came to Arkansas claiming to have a cure for cancer that wouldn't involve surgery, wouldn't involve these long periods of suffering through the treatment as well. People could come to this hospital that he was opening and
yeah,
they could be cured of their cancer. And one of the things that you draw out in this book is that it's not like there was no one sounding an alarm about this, but rather he went through years of litigation with, the American Medical Association. You cite to references where the Journal of the American Medical Association is
yeah,
denouncing this man and his cures, and of course, ultimately is, I don't feel afraid to use the word con man, being that he was convicted in federal court at
yeah,
the end of this story for mail fraud relating
yeah.
to bringing people into this hotel on the promise of being able to cure them of cancer.
Yeah, and that's where Harvey Fuller came into play, because he was postmaster, and so they worked with the feds to
kind of nail him on mail fraud. It's much how, like how they would bring down like mobsters during that period. It's not directly, it's sort of indirectly, through like
Sure.
mail fraud or something.
Al Capone on tax fraud.
Exactly, exactly. So yeah, many of the people, what they didn't realize is, Baker was the youngest of 10 he was from Muscatine, Iowa. That was a river town up right on the Mississippi. And his father was a machinist. His mother she contributed writings to magazines. So he had kind of the best of both worlds when it comes to like kind of having this mechanical engineering mind, and also he kind of understood kind of writing. But he was actually he drops out of high school when he's like in the 10th grade, and he starts working for his father's at his machine shop. And then his dad and him have a falling out, which he has a falling out with almost everybody that he meets throughout.
Does seem to be a theme.
That's a theme with him. He's in, like you said, he was in constant litigation with everybody, making enemies with everybody. He then goes to another. It was called the Beppel Button Company, and they made pearl buttons. They would fish out from the Mississippi, Mississippi River, and then make these pearl buttons. And he had a falling out with him as well, Mr. Beppel. But he kind of honed his skills as a machinist, and he was very mechanical. So he understood that skill set. He was very smart, but then he decided to go into like vaudeville and go on this sort of vaudeville circuit where it was like he became a mentalist, and he was doing these sort of, it was also kind of like a con artist type thing where he was doing these kind of making money off sort of scamming people, on doing these kind of stage shows where he would kind of con people out of their money. And he would have these assistants. He called them his Madam Tangley. And many of these performances had this sort of like Egyptian motif. So I kind of used some of that in my book. And he would levitate women, and I bet I would love to be able to go back in time and see these shows. He was inspired by, there was the Flints. Herbert Flint was his name. He was his mentalist who was like, he was really just kind of emulating what Herbert Flint did. And he ends up marrying one of his Tangley women. Her name was Teresa Pender, and they were married for like less than 5 years, and then they divorced. They said amicably, but who knows. But then right around that time, he puts together, and there's some question as to whether he did this himself or who owns the patent, or who should be attributed to. But he puts together a air calliope. It's one of the, what a calliope is, one of those, like a circus
Sort of like an
calliope.
organ.
Yes, that would be found in circuses and performances and like. But he did so. Before that, they all ran on steam, and they were very dangerous because they would explode, And
Oh,
but his was the first air calliope, so it ran on air, and it was much safer. And he made what would be now, he made millions off it. It'd be, comparable to like nowadays would be, yeah, millions off of these. He called it the Tangley Calliophone. And that was and he made, yeah. And in fact, there are people today that's what they know Baker for, are his calliophons. And you can still find those today, like some of his air
mhm.
calliophons. I mean, they would be used for like roller skating rinks, circuses, baseball games. They would be on the back of trucks for politicians and for advertising.
Do they have one at the Baker Hotel? Because there is an image in the book of him sitting on a balcony at the Baker Hotel playing, or the Crescent
Yeah.
Hotel
Oh
rather,
yeah.
playing it.
He always had one of those on him. Like in fact, so he always used that. Like when he would then make a run for like, and a political, he would try to make political gains or whatever. And
He ran for U.S. Senate in Iowa, correct?
exactly. Yeah, he did. And he would use the calliope, and he'd put those on the back of a truck, and he'd go around, and he couldn't play, it would just play itself, but he would have that blaring, and they're extremely loud. When he made that Senate run, he would just have that going off. It was kind of, I mean, he was utilizing a lot of his skill sets from doing his vaudeville type mentalist performances, and then he was combining it with this invention of his to sort of gain attention and notoriety. And then around this time, this is in the early 20s, radio starts coming in to being, and then he
he puts up a radio station in Muscatine, Iowa, and he somehow talks the city into letting him do this, and that would be beneficial to them. And it's just kind of, once again, he kind of scams the city into giving him money so he could put up this radio station. And he calls it KTNT, which is an acronym for Know the Naked Truth, and which is about anything but, um, and then he put out a TNT magazine, The Naked Truth, where he would just really, he was talking, where he started kind of getting into like just lashing out against public officials.
This is a man who led a very colorful life
Very
long
colorful.
before deciding he knew how to cure cancer.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, he was very controversial in the sense that, for instance, he was always against the medical establishment. He would always make comments on his radio station against like medical practitioners. He called pediatricians pedophiles. He would say just horrible things for no reason. There was no basis in reality. But then there was also, like, he was telling local farmers, because he started to get a lot of attention from like the local, like the farmers in the area, because this is a time when it's kind of like modernity was coming in, and it's like a lot of these farmers, like their kids were growing up and moving away, and they felt like they were just being outpaced by like the modern era, in some ways. And Baker was really kind of capitalizing on that and telling them that he was for the working class, like the farmers and the hard working people of Muscatine. And he got into this thing they called it the cow wars, where he was telling farmers tuberculosis was a bad thing going on at that time. And particularly there was bovine tuberculosis. So cows were veterinarians were testing cattle to make sure they didn't have tuberculosis. So Baker gets on there and he starts on his radio station telling the farmers of Iowa, he said, don't get your cows vaccinated, because what's going to happen, these vets are going to come around and they're going to give you a false positive and then he's going to take away your healthy cattle. And so farmers just became livid, and so what they ended up doing is they all started just kind of rising up, and they went to the courthouse, and they violently protested, and it really got so bad they had to call in the state militia to stop it.
Thank God we never saw this kind of behavior again in American life.
It is
These
wild.
archetypes. I mean, good
It
gracious.
it really is. Well, it was all just, his whole past is so checkered.
So at what point does he come into this concept of having the cure for cancer and make the decision to relocate to Arkansas instead of a hospital?
On his Okay, so in his magazine, The Naked Truth, that's where he kind of tells all his stuff about, don't about cows not being vaccinated. So, and then from that he starts going into the AMA. He starts really renouncing the AMA, saying they're just meat cutters. AMA means the American Meat Cutters Association. He just has this horrible, relationship with them. And so he's also always in trouble with the FCC, the Radio Commission, and because he's always amping up his wattage. So it's like can be spread all over the US, like you could pick up KT&T radio all the way up in Alaska and like clear out to like Honolulu, and they would
No
always come out
kidding.
and, oh yeah, at some point, sometimes they would always come, and but see, he knew he was at the highest point of Muscatine, and whenever he'd see him coming his way, he would always just kind of bring the wattage down, and he'd be like, well, I don't know what you're talking about, it was just. But then he finds out about this guy named Dr. Charles Ozias out of Kansas City, Missouri, who claims to have the cure for cancer. And so he has him on his radio show, and Dr. Ozias says, about his cancer cure, and so Baker's like, well, that works for me, that he's got this cancer cure. And so he basically steals this guy's fake cancer cure, and then he puts it in his catalog in his TNT magazine that he's got the cure for cancer. And to prove it, he has 5 test patients that he has in his magazine, and he's going to show how that he's cured cancer. And so this comes out like in I can't remember the exact year, but it comes out in like January or whatever, or November. I can't remember the year of like 2020 or 1924, something like that. And it's like, and then, but then so he has 5 test patients. They're all sick with cancer, but by like May of that year, all 5 are dead.
Sure. And yet he's already published the results of their great cure,
Yes, and he reprints that same magazine like 3 different times without changing a single word.
even
And
after
then
their deaths.
that's when he opens up the first Baker Hospital in Muscatine, Iowa, until finally it gets pretty complicated. But basically, he's run out of Iowa for practicing without a license, and then he sets up shop down in Mexico. He becomes
Mhm.
what they call one of the border blasters. He out of Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, and so he's able to do all this. He can go against the Federal Radio Commission and the AMA, and practice because he's outside of the U.S. border, and so but he's just right on the other side.
Sure, sure.
He did that for 4 or 5 years, and then he ends up going back to Muscatine, where he only serves 1 day in prison, 1 day, and then
Okay.
and then he tries to start up his or keep it going in Muscatine, but it doesn't really pan out. So he ends up setting up shop in Eureka Springs, and then he ends up
Okay.
moving his patients from Muscatine down to Eureka Springs.
Well, one of the things that you then focused in the book was sort of a public debate, I think, that was happening in the local newspaper over whether this Norman Baker was good for Eureka Springs, a town
Right.
that was, as you describe it, sort of economically dying at the time.
Oh, for
And
sure.
so, as families come to bring their loved ones for cancer treatment,
Yeah.
it sounds like people are not scrutinizing too carefully whether or not this is really great medical treatment because they are seeing the economic benefit. People coming into town, bringing new people, new life, of course, their money with them
Yeah.
for these medical treatments.
Right. Yeah. And they were very painful medical treatments. He would basically inject his cancer serum, which was carbolic acid, glycerin, spring water, crushed up watermelon seeds, and it does not cure cancer, and just into areas where he would say, well, this is where the cancer is, and he would inject it. Oftentimes, like in the chest throughout the day, like different times of day they would inject it. But yeah, the people, the local newspaper, there's like when he first came to town, they all welcomed him, and there was like just a 2-page spread where it's all the different businesses, welcome Norman Baker, welcome Norman Baker, and they were all said their whatever their thing, their greetings to Norman Baker, welcoming him to the town. And you got to remember that, like I said, this is the height of the Great Depression, and Eureka Springs was not doing well at all. Like, I mean, people were starving. Like they were literally going out and just shooting squirrels for dinner, if they went, and then they would deplete the squirrel population, and then that there wasn't anything for them, and so when Baker decides to set up shop, he really did have kind of a name for himself, and people were just so desperate. That's why they just, like, a lot of them knew, and that's where it's really, it's kind of one of those things. It's like, well, this guy's a con man, but then you have people that it's their last hope, it's their last chance at, if they're sick. And at that time, it's not like the AMA really knew, they certainly were doing much more for the patients than he was, but medicine was not nearly as advanced as it is today. And so
Can you talk about what led to his arrest?
basically what happened was Baker is sending out his flyers all over I show one of those kind of in my book, and it's basically saying we cure cancer.
Mhm.
And that's really how they were when Claude Fuller was working with Harvey Fuller, his brother, the postmaster. They kind of did the sting operation where they had it sent to specific people, and they were basically able to kind of get him on mail fraud because he's sending out these all over. He sent them out all over the country when he wasn't curing cancer. I mean, it was really That was
Sure.
basically it.
So he's ultimately arrested in September of 1939. He goes to trial in Little Rock in federal court
Yeah.
and is convicted of mail fraud. And he ends up being
Yeah.
sentenced to 4 years in prison. And of course, the hotel at some point later goes back to being a hotel.
Yeah, right around like the mid 1940s, there's some guys that coming down from like Chicago, and they open it back up as the Crescent Hotel.
So your book, and you use this frame, what follows is true, as sort of a, I guess, a series lead. And so
Yeah.
it's what follows is true Crescent Hotel. And after telling the story of Norman Baker and the Crescent Hotel, you have since begun working on another project based on another significant and history laden aspect of Arkansas life. This one located here in central Arkansas, where I am, in the
Yeah.
Little Rock area, the Plum Bayou Mounds. And you are working on a book, What Follows is True Plum Bayou Mounds right now. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. So through my Crescent Hotel, my What Follows is True Crescent Hotel book, I was reached out to by the University of Arkansas's Archaeological Survey, and then they connected me with the Plum Bayou Mounds, and they just basically asked. They said, "Hey, have you ever been to the Plum Bayou Mounds?" And I was like, "No, I no," and but I had heard of them because it was formerly Toltec. It was known as the Toltec Mounds,
Until
and
just a few years ago, this was known as the Toltec Mounds.
right, yeah, and that was a misnomer, and they knew that way back, like in the late 1800s. They knew that because the Smithsonian came down, and but they just kind of stuck. The Toltec name stuck,
Sure.
and anyway, the director of who's Dr. Paige Ford, the head archaeologist at the site, got in contact with her through the University of Arkansas's Archaeological Survey, and they just basically were like, "Would you be interested in doing a book with us about the history of these ancient native mounds that date back to the late woodland period?" So they're about 1,000 years old.
Wow.
These mounds, yeah, they're these just native mounds, and once again, it's so much of my these this What Follows is True series is really kind of site specific. Like I really love this idea of like being able to go to a place and then you can kind of explore it yourself. And that's really what, like if the Crescent Hotel didn't really exist today, if it had been destroyed, there was a time where it was going to be destroyed. It's like, well, then I wouldn't have done the book. But since it's a place you can go to and you can then learn about it, this ancient mound site in Scott, Arkansas, just about 20-minute drive from Little Rock, is an actual.
You know, I didn't grow up here in Little Rock, but my wife did. And of course, my son is now growing up here. And every school child in central Arkansas goes to, I almost called it the Toltec Mounds just because
Sure,
I'm so used to hearing that for the
of
last 20
course.
plus years. But every school child in central Arkansas goes to the Plum Bayou Mounds as part of an educational school field trip at some point in their young life. And so
Yeah.
what you're putting together now is going to be a resource, especially I think that can connect with younger people because they'll understand, that graphic format. But you are putting in ton of very interesting research. I mean, I read from some of the materials that you have that you've got this collaboration with some of the local tribal nations.
Yep.
There's an advising committee that's going into this book in addition to working with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. And so this is
Correct.
not something where you go out for an afternoon and, see what you read on the placard and do a graphic novel about it.
No, no. In fact, Dr. Paige Ford, she's really heading all that up, like the storyline, and I'm working closely with her to visually kind of put this all together with her. They're actually, when this book's finished, it's going to be sent to middle school kids all over the state of Arkansas to schools,
Oh,
and
wow.
and they're going to be building curriculum based on our book. And so there is definitely going to be an educational aspect to it because it is. And I've told, like, I'm working with Paige, we don't want the book to feel overly didactic, like we're just, so it's just a teaching resource. We want it to tell the story in an entertaining way so they can feel like, oh, I'm really kind of not only just learning something, but it's also just a very interesting story about these mounds and the archaeology that goes on about, how they kind of, because with this, it's like that's what you've got are these mounds. It's such an unusual space because that area, the Plum Bayou region near the Arkansas River there in Scott, Arkansas, is just flatlands. And then all of a sudden there's these massive mounds that just rise up, and it's so out of place. It's like, what is this? Yeah. So it's really just this really interesting story about kind of the detective work that goes on, within, archaeology.
Oh, sure, sure. Now, your first book, Crescent Hotel, and
Yeah.
I'm sitting here with a copy of it on my desk that
Oh,
you were kind enough to autograph for me when I got to meet you in person a few weeks ago. But it is a really beautiful, nice hardback book. It's almost 240 pages long. And you were telling me that the Plum Bayou Mounds book is going to be much more easily digestible for a younger audience. More like 80 pages, is that right?
yep, right around there. Yeah, in fact, I
Okay.
just finished up the roughs. We're just I just sent those. In fact, just earlier this weekend or on
Oh,
Friday or something like that, I sent the final, or well, the we're really really close to completion of getting the roughs all approved, and then once that happens, we're going to I'm going to start working on the final pages for this book. And so we've really got it all visualized, like we've got the whole thing kind of storyboarded now. And once that
fantastic.
happens, yeah, it really moves forward fast.
Do you have a sense yet of when you expect this book will actually see the light of day?
I plan on finishing it in 26 next year. So I
Okay,
plan on finishing it over that next year. And then it's kind of then it's out of my hands. I'm just gonna I'll be we'll see how fast we can get that. And I think they want to get it. They really want to get it out there fast too. So I would, maybe we could get it out in the later 26, early 27, something like that.
sure,
You know,
sure. How long does it take you to do a single page for a book like this? Between penciling, the inking, and the painting?
yeah. Well, it's kind of hard to say because the thing is, I what I generally do is I start off doing these really, in fact, you can see right here, like I'm doing little teeny tiny drawings like that. I do it this size, like these little
Sure.
tiny,
So you've got like 9 to a page of a computer sheet of thumbnails, basically.
but those are what we're done on with pencil on a little, and I basically print out and then I draw with pencil onto and I do little thumbnails about that big, literally
Hmm.
that big, a little tiny, just a little over an inch tall or whatever. And because then when I do it small like that, then I get a good sense of composition, because then you can
Okay.
blow that up and then I can start working on the final drawings. And it's really hard to answer that question. A lot of people ask me that because it's like, well, since this is all nonfiction and I have to do so much research for all of it, it's like, because once I do that, then I've got to get it all approved. And then once I get draw after that, and it's like, if I'm able to just sit down and draw, I can get it all. I can get a page done, and then I can get it drawn and painted, probably in a few days. But the thing is, with my process, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw all 70 pages or whatever it is. I'm going to draw them out in pencil, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to start spotting blacks throughout the whole thing.
Hmm.
And then from that, so it almost looks like, then it starts to almost look like a comic, like you'd almost see, like, as you get these black areas and all that. But then I like going in with watercolor and I'll start doing value, like I'm layering in grayscale, like value. And so and then I just start building it up on top of that. But so it's like I have like three different passes I go through. It's
Sure,
wild.
sure.
Like
Now, you showed me just a moment ago your thumbnail images, I
little
guess, as I'm
thumbnails. Yep.
calling them. Will you take those and just blow them up on a light box and go straight to inks from there, or will you do a pencils on your watercolor paper
Yeah, I'll
from
I'll
there?
I'll do it on the paper from there. Like I use that as kind of a guide, like a style guide, and then I'll
Okay,
draw them. But I'm also looking at, like, oh gosh, like so much of this, like the visitor center, the mounds themselves, the location of everything. Like I've got all kinds of reference material that I'm looking at because I've got to be pretty accurate, because it's a
sure,
nonfiction, book. And so I've got all this stuff laid out as I'm drawing all this stuff. And so it's really kind of complicated, but it's kind of fun too, just kind of putting it all together and also just trying to make it as interesting as I can, with lighting and whatnot. at the end of the day, I really want it to be an interesting read and fun, but also, I want to not only, entertain, but educate as well, but to inspire people. I want them to be curious about this site, and I want them to go to the place. That's
Yeah,
really what it's all about. Curiosity. I just want
sure.
people to have curiosity.
Well, you can sign me up for a copy of that and for making a special visit out there to the mounds to follow up and learn more about the history of that area that's so local for me. So, Sean, this has been wonderful. I mean, really, I hope listeners will. First of all, your website where people can get a copy of this book
Yeah.
from you and shipped right to them
Yep, that's right.
is seanfitzgibbon.com.
SeanFitzgibbon.com. Yeah, it's SEAN and then FITZGIBBON.com. And then also sign up for my newsletter. If you go to connect on there, like there's store, and then you can buy it. If you click on store, you can buy the book. And then on connect, there's like when you click on that, you can connect with me or you can sign up for the newsletter. So if you sign up for the newsletter, pretty much every month or so, I'll just kind of put out what's new. I teach, like I said, classes I'm doing, books I've got coming out, events, any speaking events, or just anything I've got going on. I'll put it out there on the newsletter.
Yeah, and for listeners, we'll put a link to your website in the show notes as well. And I hope people will go and check that out. Well, and we will also have some images up on our Instagram account. That's at Graphic Novel Apostle from the Crescent Hotel book. And I hope people will go there and take a look at it. And I think when you see it, you'll feel like you really do want to go dig in and
Yeah.
dive a little deeper with your own copy. So please do check that out. Sean, all my thanks for coming
Yeah.
here. I
Thanks.
hope
Yeah.
you have a
You too.
wonderful holiday season. And to all of our listeners, thank you for being here with us. As always, I will look forward to seeing you back here next week. And until then, keep reading those comics.